Thank you, Craig, and thank you also, yes, to all of you who have managed to stay in the room as well. I know there is a lot on, and after that group of speakers, what an act to follow. That is true. Fortunately, we're all just as funny as Olympia. Probably, I'd say we'll have laughs, we'll have tears, and perhaps worth more than all of that, we are going to be talking about an area where there is just going to be such an enormous wave of investment. So, money is the one thing that's driving everything that investors look at, and if you look at the numbers around it, the numbers are huge. So the World Economic Forum suggests that half of the world's output, that's $44 trillion, is dependent on nature, and they say that basically there's a $10 trillion opportunity, a business opportunity for nature and nature investments by 2030, which is why we're talking about natural capital today, because that is the kind of the buzzword, and it's basically the new framework whereby investors are looking at how they can invest in nature and the land, and that's what our panel's about today. So we've got a great selection of people, from policy to investors to farmers, and I guess accountants in the finance sector as well. So looking at kind of what this works, how this works both on farm, from an investment perspective, and then what actually is going to be the frameworks that create the system for the investment. So I'm going to go to each of my panelists in turn, just because I think the problem with natural capital is it's a buzzword and it's two words, but there's so much to unpack in there. So I think I'm going to start with you, Heech, because I think probably you sort of encapsulate the investment side of things. What is natural capital to you, and how does that kind of work in the framework of the world that you live in?
Thank you. It is a great question, and I ask that question every day in front of the mirror because it slightly changes depending on who you're talking to, who your audience is. But from our perspective, and certainly my perspective, just broadly, natural capital are just natural assets that intrinsically have value for all of us, whether it's, if you're, for medicine, for food, for fibre, for water, for animals and shade. It's intrinsically, it has value, but it's been free. And so from an investment lens, we look at assets that you can price that value because there's a service that is being delivered to another person. So for Australia, it's agriculture, it's forestry, those two key sort of assets in nature that are critical to our economy, but also from a decarbonisation perspective and our low-carbon future for Australia, also really critical in the transition pathway.
Great. And Nicole, your job is actually writing the taxonomy around this. Give us the taxonomy version, please.
So for those of you that maybe don't speak finance every day, I'll just give a little bit of a detour to what is the taxonomy. In this context, we're actually just talking about a classification system, which looks at activities across the economy and classifies them according to their sustainability cred. So that could be whether they drive climate mitigation outcomes, adaptation and resilience outcomes, or promote nature. So in that context, when we are thinking about natural capital, we're really looking at identifying the activities, the management practices, and investments into these natural assets that Heech has been talking about, in order to really look after that asset, grow that asset, right? To protect it, to enhance it, to restore it, so that we have a good natural asset base to continue producing the things that we want going forward.
Okay. Catherine, any points to add to that? You want to give it from the perspective of what you're working on in terms of RSM and how you're working with farmers to kind of bring that information down, I guess, to the grassroots level. And then we'll go to you, Bob, obviously, and talk about it from what it looks like to you from the farmer's perspective.
Thank you. So from our perspective, I guess from the accounting perspective, natural capital now means business risk. To your point, 50% of GDP, global GDP, is dependent on nature. So this is kind of the alarm bells are going off based on the fact that the depletion of our natural assets globally is a business risk, and it's a risk to our global financial markets. So the money and the markets have woken up, and now essentially they've turning this into an accounting practice. So essentially over the last couple of years, the frameworks, sustainability frameworks to report on natural capital, sustainability and climate, it's been pretty busy, and I'm not going to go into the alphabet soup. I'll try and do my best to keep it really simple for the purposes here of what's going on. So the frameworks have consolidated, and IFRS, which is the International Financial Reporting Standard, has essentially come up with two standards, S1, S2. S1 is essentially ESG. S2 is climate risk, and very quickly we're going to have nature-related reporting, which comes in the form of an acronym called TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures. S2 is TCFD, and this is the one that Australia is leading with. And as our compere MC was just noting, that this is the one that is being introduced 1st of July this year. Globally, IFRS S1 and S2 are already implemented. They've been launched 1st of January this year, which means countries around the world are now contextualising this in their own jurisdictions. So for Australia, it's being contextualised here, and we're starting with climate first, but that's not to say everything else is not being considered. So really, we're looking at material risks to business, and this is again, we're looking at the risk side of the lens, and that is to looking at what is the risk to business, and your operations is one side of the coin. But obviously, we need to look at the opportunity and recognise that our markets are transforming at breakneck speed. There's physical issues around climate change and nature loss that we need to consider. But also the transitionary sides of things is that we're electrifying everything all at once. There's new products and services coming to market now, and this is going to, and we all need to be aware of, are we going to see a Kodak moment? The answer to that is yes, we're going to see many of them. Mm-hmm. So,
great setup. And Bob, every farmer I ever speak to says, I've been invested in natural capital my entire life, and so has my family, for all the generations, otherwise we would not have a generational family farm. How do you get your head around the idea of natural capital, this new buzzword, for what you do? And just tell us about your farm too, would be great. Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah, thanks, Jackson. So I'm very much going to look at today with a grower lens. And firstly, just want to start off, like 50% of the Australian continent is actually controlled and managed by producers, so we have a bigger impact than anyone on natural capital. And just to follow in the theme of Evoke, the first thing I did this morning when I woke up was actually went to ChatGPT and asked it what natural capital is, so I could actually know what I'm talking about today. But we've already touched on most of it, but I'll just the last sentence in it. Firstly, I actually said, is natural capital a buzzword, and it said it's actually a lot more than a buzzword. So
that's a good slogan, actually. More than a buzzword.
Just the last sentence. ChatGPT, sustainable agricultural practices aim to preserve and enhance natural capital to ensure long-term food production while minimising environmental degradation. So to me, that'd make a really good mission statement for pretty much every farming business in Australia, across Australia. I'm just going to grab a couple of local examples. So I farm the West Australian wheat belt. The WA wheat belt, it's the Yilgarn block. They're the oldest, most weathered, infertile landscapes in the world. There's a lot of salts built up in those landscapes. So, we've got a lot of work to do to maintain and improve that. And probably as a grower, I look at it in two different ways. You look at soil, that's our biggest asset. What is natural capital when you're talking about soil? So the biggest aim in probably our farming business is to maximise soil cover at all time to protect that all-important soil resource and build soil health. So, I don't know, you could comment, to me, that's natural capital? Does everyone, we're in agreement there? Yes. And the other one, we've done, so there's a lot of probably degraded land in WA from times in the past when we haven't probably had the right farming system for the landscape. So that country is really suited to re-veg. So we've done our own re-veg project. We've planted 700 hectares back to a biodiversity plant, and we really targeted biodiversity broad species mix with lots of gaps for also natural regeneration of wildflowers and all the rest. And to me, carbon's probably the main driver, because carbon to me is a building block of natural capital, and it's always going to be the biggest value pool that's going to basically pay for all the cool stuff that attaches to carbon, the co-benefits that Richard Eckard talks about, which is the likes of, biodiversity, whole of landscape management for salinity and all the rest. So, okay, we've done that. Hopefully we'll get a carbon payment. We're going to maintain those credits and hopefully insert them. But carbon is the payment that we'll hopefully one day receive. But to me, the biggest benefit there is biodiversity and natural capital. So we're all in agreement as the grower to...
Yep.
Yep, great. Nicole, obviously we've turned, in the last few years we've gone from kind of worried about carbon reporting and emissions reporting to this idea of natural capital. So it's sort of turning it around to an incentive-based product, I suppose, rather than a punitive one, or it's trying to blend them together. Given that you're at the Sustainable Finance Institute, and you're dealing with a lot of finance investment companies who are worried about this, give me a sense of how focused superannuation funds in Australia are on this topic, how much you think that there's going to be a pipeline of investment looking for a home in this area, and how do you write the rules for it that people know what they're investing in and why they're investing in it?
Sure, that's a big and loaded question. So I think the education and awareness curve has been a hockey stick, right? So, and I do give credit to the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures for sort of putting this on the agenda. That's not to say that there was great work that was going on for many, many years before that. The Capitals Coalition and the work of Accounting for Nature, all Australian companies that have really been doing great work in this space. But this kind of put it onto the agenda for the first time, and now you are having these conversations across financial institutions, both in the debt space and in the equity space, saying, what is this thing? What do we mean? What does it look like? But, I don't want to create the impression, well, now we're all going to rush out and make investments, right? There is a huge leap from talking about this as an issue that's on the agenda and then figuring out, what does this mean for me? What does risk mean for me from a nature perspective? How do I look at this? How do I account for it? And then what does opportunity mean, right? And I think that definition in the opportunity space, we have a few and a handful of experts in this space, and I would say Heech is definitely one of them that's sitting here next to me, but it's a lonely field, I think, in the moment in Australia, and I think less than 3% of our pension pool goes towards natural capital assets. I can't see that immediately shifting anytime soon. So we really need to start making visible what those opportunities are, and to understand what the risks are, but also that they are manageable. And so to your second question around creating the rules and the system around this, for me, this is why I think we need to look at natural capital. It is in its inherent nature holistic. I agree with Bob that carbon is the moneymaker that kind of gets things started. But if we are really to understand the value of natural capital, the resilience benefits that it provides, help to mitigate that risk. We need to understand how these things all work together, so that once investors and financiers understand the risk, right, then the appetite is open to grow, and then we need to start packaging up those opportunities. And some of the barriers to that are an understanding point thing. Some of them are also scale and long duration of returns and other things. So it is a long way to go.
And I'm just going to pull up on one thing though. You said 3% of Australia's pension pool, and I haven't got that number to hand, but what number is that? Australia's pension pool is what,
$5 trillion?
$5 trillion?
Ish.
5 trillion each. So 3% of 5 trillion. Okay, so that's a pretty big number. And that's that's effectively for alternative assets in a natural capital space, right?
Yeah. But I think I was actually looking at the other way. It's small. I think we can do better. I think we can do bigger. I think a lot of the large institutional investment that is happening in the space is actually coming inward, not from within, right? It is something that we have a very sort of conservative, financial system, and I think it's something that I naturally gravitate towards from an asset class point of view.
and Heech, because you're at the bleeding edge of this, right? Because you're actually making investments ahead of a lot of these investments. So talk about what you're seeing in terms of, I guess, setting some of the advanced party kind of landmarks in this space, and what sort of conversations you're having with investors, both in Australia and globally, who are looking to get into this, and what are they saying to you?
Yeah. First of all, I would say that I think the Australian superannuation funds are laggards in the natural capital sector, and they have been for many, many years. And, you know, we're having conversations with them all the time, but actually the capital inflows that are coming in, and we're talking big licks of capital, hundreds of $1 million, are coming from our offshore pension funds. And the question they always ask me is, well, why is there any other Australian pension fund investing alongside of us? And the truth of the matter is, it's difficult for them because of various regulatory constraints, data points around past performance. You know, they're all risk managers. Investors are literally risk managers, not too dissimilar from farmers. You know, we're managing risk all the time. So they need those things to be able to invest confidently. And it's your money, it's your wealth, it's your children's wealth. So it's important. But I think our role is to stand in the market, to back the sector inherently, to say it is investable. You can make a decent return. You have to be patient. You have to understand the risk. And actually, the rewards are fantastic if you can actually get your head around those things. So we bring in capital partners with us. So whether it's the recent Canadian pension fund that co-invested alongside of us and put 3 times of our capital into a farmland investment portfolio, for us that's success. That's sort of indicating to the world Australia's natural capital assets are investable. They make money, and we're incredibly efficient. So that's sort of that's what I see as our greatest value add in this asset class.
Catherine, it's an interesting one, right? I mean, I guess we're going to jump around a little bit, but we talked about kind of the framework sort of coming in, and we're going to see some examples of that. It's going to happen with some of the investments that CFC is making. But how is that going to then start to translate down to the farmer?
So it is going to catch everyone, not just farmers, but it's going to catch all sectors, all businesses. We primarily work with the middle market, small businesses at RSM, and we, you know, talking to our clients, are already feeling the questions that are coming down the line through the supply chain, whether it's Costco from the US, or whether it's, you know, the insurance, or it's the bankers, or whether it's, you know, the supplier up the road, or it's employees as well. So even our own company is being questioned around our, you know, what's our stance on certain issues. So listen, I think it's not coming from any one point, but absolutely the climate risk reporting that's going to become mandatory reporting, phased in, starting with the large end of town. But what that requirement is by the second year is what we call that Scope 3 emissions, which, you know, it's going to connect everyone. And one of my clients puts it, it's the beautiful thing of Scope 3, because it's basically going to ensure that we all have to start this engagement with our suppliers. And you will have seen, not to mention Coles too much, but they did come out not so long ago and say they're going to partner with 75% of their supply chain, and would like to have, or are looking to partner with them to have transition plans of their suppliers. So in my mind, that is wow, because not only do 75% of everything that I see on the shelves, and I was there last night looking for things, going, wow, all these suppliers are going to have to provide, not only understand what their carbon emissions are, but they're going to have to come up with a transition plan around how are they going to reduce their emissions. And so this is really the conversation that we all need to get familiar with, understand that that it's the next thing we all need to know. It's that carbon is the new black, as my cookie said at the event the other day, and it's the new liability on our balance sheet. So better that we all kind of lean into it and start getting, and as Nicole was saying, we're having this hockey stick educational moment at the moment around all things sustainability, climate, natural capital. What does it mean to me? And it does mean different things to everyone, but ultimately you need to look at inside your business to start with, and then you need to look at the opportunities externally around what are the new nature positive opportunities out there, and that is a huge opportunity for the farming industry, agricultural business.
And I don't want to go too deeply down the rabbit hole of carbon reporting because we're talking about natural capital here, but it would be good to get a sense from you the work that you're doing at RSM. What are you seeing in terms of feedback from farmers? Like how many are kind of alive to this is coming down the pipe and quite quickly, and how many are prepared, would you say?
Listen, it's a really mixed bag. On one side, and I've hearing some wonderful stories this week about farmers such as yourself that are doing some amazing things on the property. I mean, I don't want to call out the gentleman that I heard speak on Monday, but he was so invested and so emotional when he was talking about what he was doing. Like, I couldn't help but be moved. But, I was similarly at a friend's property on Saturday who just kind of threw her hands up and went, oh my gosh, this is something else we need to do. Like, isn't life hard enough as it is? And I really do feel for that, for those people. But, again, trying to switch the narrative around to it's information in your business that is yet to be unlocked. And whilst, yes, there's a compliance element to actually collecting that information in your business and understanding what that is, there's actually opportunities in that data. Again, we've tracked financial accounting very well. We're now being asked to do non-financial accounting, and that is to account for these intangibles, account for some other areas of our business that really is, opportunities to really refine and create that. Take your business into the new green economy, low carbon economy, which is what we're all being asked to do.
Great. So, Bob, your perspective. So, I mean, obviously you've got all this reporting coming towards you, so I'd just like to get your perspective on that. And then how are you thinking about flipping that around? And what do you see actually as the opportunity over and above the standard return that you would get on your farm from some of these initiatives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Probably my head goes straight to, it's such a big, wide, diverse country, so many agricultural sectors. I don't know what it is, last count, you hear the figure of, say, 80,000 agricultural businesses. How do we capture regionality in this? And then if we go to like our WA example, the biggest sector is grains. The vast majority of that goes to Southeast Asia, where 30 to 40% of income gets spent on food. Their primary focus is just cheap, reliable, chem residue, free food, and so for me, like it's going to become part of the day to day, just to basically maintain the status quo for trade and market access in those sort of markets, if that makes sense, and how we can value add beyond that. I think it is limited. We've got, with ISCC, we've had small parcels of malt barley going to Europe, and we've been really successful with canola going into biofuel markets, but they're not mass markets. And I guess that then leads into the concern, it's going to create another level of compliance, another level of potentially costs that, like we heard before with tech, that all then falls back onto the grower, limited ability to add value and pass it on. But I think that's probably where I started. The real value to like natural capital. It's all about improving your asset base, and probably with that comes productivity increases. And you probably did touch on it, Catherine. The word narrative, like my favourite saying in ag: if you don't build your own narrative. Someone else will build it for you. And like obviously for social licence, all the rest and sustainability, I think this is going to be a really, really useful tool in building that narrative going forward.
Yeah, and I think we had this conversation before we had the panel, but talking about the concept that sort of farmers are sort of perceived by consumers in cities as sort of not great stewards of the lands, or kind of, you know, sort of mass production, you know, don't care as much as they should. Do you think that kind of changing that narrative around natural capital will actually enhance the perception of farmers, because they can see all the great work that you're doing and it's actually being quantified and valued in a way that people are going, oh, I'm buying something that people have really put a lot of effort and care into? Yeah,
absolutely. I think a big part of this, if you're looking at the bottom-up approach with, you know, with R&D and that, there's going to be a really good opportunity to develop good methodology and metrics to really demonstrate what we're doing. And yeah, ag as a whole, we do an awesome job, but we've also got to acknowledge as growers and be mature enough to acknowledge that it is a journey of continual improvement and we don't get it all right, and we've got to own that, and this is going to be another stepping stone to actually improving what we do and actually really lift the industry into the next sort of phase, yeah.
And Nicole, this is where the taxonomy is really important, right? Because if we have standard, consistent metrics that everyone agrees on to make these investments and make these improvements, then you can report those back to the supermarkets, obviously, but at the end of the day, the consumers as well. So rather than having greenwashing packaging on products, for instance, or, you know, someone sort of claiming they're great when there's no way to kind of measure it, this is going to completely change that, right?
Yeah, you know, and this is almost like the dichotomy that we have, because natural capital is not simple, and it probably doesn't always boil down to one simple metrics. There are regional differentiations. So how do you, and absolutely you do need that consistency in understanding what's happening on the ground up and what is being reported and what's being demanded from the top down. Our job, I guess, is to try and remove that friction as much as possible and ensure those communication channels are open so that you don't have distorting outcomes, right? Where demands that are coming from one side are actually leading to perverse outcomes on the ground or unintended consequences. And so that fine-tuning and calibration to ensure that there is actually benefits that are happening on the ground, that we're capturing that we are defining that in a way that it also enables growth and innovation, because science is evolving, our understanding of things are evolving. So how do we create that certainty but also leave room for innovation at the ground level, while you have these increasing demands that Catherine mentioned in terms of we need to start tracking, we need to kind of all get serious about driving sustainability. And I guess that's a challenge that the taxonomy is in a way trying to achieve. And again, you know, going back to why I think looking at things quite holistically, not from a very narrow focused way around just you know, mitigation outcomes or just it can create distortionary effects, and ecosystems work together as a whole and they drive different positive outcomes, so we need to ensure that we encapsulate that as well.
And the question, I guess, will be when? When will we have this taxonomy? Because people are being forced to report on it now, right? And we're going to have, just like Coles and Woolworths, you know, Coles saying we want 75% of our suppliers to have this reporting right. Are we going to end up, though, with sort of an odd patchwork where there's people at one end who are working on kind of, I've just got to get out whatever number I can to satisfy Coles requirements, rather than solving the actual issue, like which is going to come first and how soon away is there on a kind of a defined taxonomy we can all agree on?
Yeah, and it is a bit of a sequencing and a fine art to get this all right. So you've got the two sides of the coin. You've got the disclosure side, which is really a risk-based mechanism, right? We're looking at what are our physical risks, what are the transition risks that are coming down the pipeline, looking at that in the context of different temperature scenarios, setting targets, and then aiming to achieve them. When you're aiming to achieve them, what does that mean? You need to turn towards the opportunity. You need to say, how am I going to shift, and what am I going to shift to? Where am I going to allocate that capital? And that's where, I guess, the taxonomy is, I guess you could say, that shopping list of opportunities that we're looking at. For us, we're aiming, and under the mandate of the Treasury, looking to develop up to 6 sectors, which includes agriculture, by the end of this year. And so it should sequence quite well. But, you know, are we going to get to everything? Are we going to get to all areas? Are we going to get to the detail that we want to in the first round? Probably not. And so we need to ensure that we're constantly feeding in and updating that as we go along.
So just to put a pin in that, so end of this year for the taxonomy for the sector, and then how long do you think it would take before we actually have something that's in use?
So that'll be for all 6. So we're developing 6 sectors across the economy. These are the same major 6 sectors that the government is developing decarbonisation plans for. So it covers off around 90% of the economy. So at least criteria that defines activities that drive mitigation outcomes will be available for agriculture and the other 5 sectors by the end of the year. That will, I predict, start as a voluntary guidance, but will provide, I think it's very much needed in the market, especially with APRA and ASIC kind of coming down with their big sticks saying don't greenwash. It hopefully will provide a lot of guidance for people to start aligning to.
Okay, great. I'm going to jump across to on-the-ground activity here with you, Heech, to start with. So you invested alongside the Canadian Pension Fund, the Quebecois, I think is...
CDPQ.
Yep.
Yeah.
So $200 million into a property in New South Wales. You're working with Gun Agri, you're creating a farming platform called Wilga Farming. So can you just give me your investment thesis on that property? What were you looking for in that property? What kind of returns, and I know often you can't say what the returns are going to be, but what kind of returns do you have to kind of match to meet market needs, etc.? And how do you plan to deliver those returns?
Yeah. The platform was initially set with $200 million, so that's an initial investment. So the idea was CDPQ could continue to invest if the investment thesis played out. So that's a win for capital investing into this sector. It wasn't set up to just purchase a single or 2 or 3 properties. It was set up to diversify its portfolio in order to manage the climatic exposures, the commodity, the markets that those commodities are produced for. So we are looking at assets in New South Wales, in Western Australia, potentially in South Australia. Just sort of depends on, I guess the markets in those regions at the time. In terms of what we were looking for, the strategy is highest and best land use. So what does that mean? Traditional agriculture investing for a lot of investors, especially Canadian investors who are directly investing in Australian farmland, have been very focused on driving yield, right? Maximum productivity. If you look at grains, it's maximum arable hectares, which potentially conflicts with the highest and best land use of that particular paddock or that particular aggregation. So this strategy was established to work out the best commodity produced on that asset. Maybe it's a transformation potential. Maybe we can, access more carbon markets through environmental planting. So it's looking at how do you maximise returns on that farm in a different business and operating model to traditionally what's been invested. And just a stat that I recently came across is that our total productivity factor in Australia has been tremendous, but it will stagnate because we're such efficient farmers. And when I say stagnate, what I mean is other markets will catch up because they are laggards. But the world to feed the growing population by 2050, if we don't increase our productivity gains across the world in farming, we will have to mow down all the trees that are left. Now that to me, all the rainforests in Brazil, that to me is an alarming fact and totally unimaginable, which is why technology and in this conference that's promoting ag tech is super important for farmers, but also investors, because we need to chase yield with a very, very, finite and highly valuable resource that's potentially not replicable ever. So that's the challenge we have, and so it needs capital.
And why are Canadian funds so intrigued by this? Because there are probably 4 or 5 Canadian pension funds who are enormous, they're the largest investors in Australian farmland as it is. And a lot of them have come in without natural capital as their kind of thesis, but increasingly you're seeing that attached to the investments that they're making. Why are the Canadians so into natural capital? And then you look at the likes of Nuveen, for instance, which is like Teachers' pension fund in the US. Why are they kind of getting into this? What are they hoping to achieve?
They see the long-term growth potential in this asset class because it's backed by land. Land is, you know, if you're owning real estate and property, you know how valuable land is. Well, imagine that in farmland. And Bob talked about Australia's, you know, land mass being half of being farmed, and so it's not going to be more in the future. We're going to have to create more with that amount of land. And so they see that growth potential. The cost of capital in Canada is very competitive, so they look at our dollar, on a dollar-dollar basis, it's attractive. Our regulatory environment is quite safe, you know, and farmers are probably the least subsidised farmers with other markets, so it's certain around regulatory exposure, and also scale. These big licks of capital need to create scale investment. So they're not really wanting to have just one farming exposure. They want multiple exposures, and so we can offer that. So, you know, and 70% of our agriculture commodities are exported. So we face a global market, and so that creates a really great investable environment for these pension funds. And so I'm hoping that the Australian pension funds see it too very soon. But yeah, that's why they're here.
Great. And we're really keen to get your questions too for this panel. So there is the Slido app that you can sign up to, and we'd love to hear your questions. Send them through, and I'll see them on the iPad here. And if you like a question, vote it up, and we'll get to as many as we can, because we've got a really good panel here who can discuss a lot of the issues. So there's huge licks of money coming to the country. Bob, does it sound like rivers of gold to you? Can it filter down to you at the farm level? I mean, is the only impact on it that it's going to increase the value of land, or is there a way that you can somehow engage with this cash as a farmer in a new and different way?
I think probably the first thing you could probably say, and this is following on from Heech, all these new markets come with a level of complexity around reporting and administration and all the rest. And the larger family farms and the corporates have a lot greater capacity to manage that and probably extract the most value. And we all know probably in the bush, the most important thing at the moment is actually the social fabric. There's less and less of us out there. So how do we actually manage this going forward to not just, you know, make it a good corporate investment, but actually be a really good thing for rural WA, rural Australia? And I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge.
But you're not worried about someone coming in and just buying up half of the land in Western Australia and planting a, you know, fence to fence, for instance?
Okay, so I know where you're going, because obviously there's been talk already. There's a whole pile of money that wants to offset in the mining industry in WA. Let's go right back. There's issues in WA. We need land care work carried out. In the early 90s, when I came home, the land care 90s, it was $2.5 billion or whatever it was of caring for country money came into WA. That money's gone. State governments, federal governments are never going to put that money back in again. But there is this absolute massive pool of money, the biggest it's ever been, that wants to actually invest in a really similar space. So how we actually work together is probably going to be key to get good outcomes for both sectors, not to the detriment of ag. And a really good example, like we'll go to Woodside, they're trying to offset with re-veg in the WA wheat belt, and it was done properly. Like they've just bought a farm next to us, and they've been actually next door. They've been really good to deal with. Where they've planted these trees was a really degraded farm because it was poor and sandy. The rain that falls there was a recharge area. It was discharging and causing downstream salinity to us. So this going into trees is going to help our farm. They're also targeting biodiversity in the planting, so that's another tick. So there's really good co-benefits. And the other where they were really, really good, we worked with them, and on this farm there was 500 hectares of really good country and a house that was valuable to our business. So we sat down and came to an agreement. We bought the 500 hectares off them and the house. They subdivided it, and they were actually really good. But the worry is they've got really ambitious targets, and the history of government policy intervention in markets is not great. Look back to the MIS schemes, and it's still unfolding at the moment with Quintos in the north with sandalwood. If, let's just say, the safeguard mechanism pushes credits to $100 a tonne, and that's really going to distort the competition for land use in WA and the woodsides to the point where if there's not policy to manage it, agriculture potentially won't be able to compete, and there could be wholesale land use change. And especially, like, we are a very variable climate. If we had 2 to 3 years of bad seasons, which has happened in the past, and becomes financial stress through the wheat belt, and all of a sudden there's this bucket of cash there, it's going to be really difficult to manage. And yeah, we've got to be really careful because we're talking 25, often 100-year time frames, so we absolutely could have a big impact on what the wheat belt looks like in WA. Because
often these companies are looking for scale, right? So from a family farm perspective, we can pick up 4 or 3 farms, in a sort of same region. Yep. Does that mean, Catherine, that if farmers are prepared for, let's just say they do want to sell, does it help to be prepared for to become a natural capital investment choice from an accounting standpoint? If you have all the bits in place to show that you have done the work, does that help you get a higher value for your property if you plan to sell, or does it actually make it easier for you to get a loan from the bank, for instance?
I'll just make quickly the comment on the competition for land and I guess where the market is at the moment. It is moving exceptionally fast, and there is this kind of, what do? We need to offset. A lot of targets have been put out by large companies, governments, etc. So the targets have been put out there, but operationalising them is now coming to pass. So it's really interesting how, and I guess that's what we really need to be careful of these sort of unintended consequences. Yeah. And before we know it, not have any farmers out there, producing the food that we need, and all covered in, forests, which would be lovely too. But so there's that. Obviously, it's a real issue that we need to obviously track. But coming back to, sustainability is a journey, and you can't leapfrog it. You need to really start at the beginning, and that is to really, start with your carbon, understand what your carbon footprint is, then go into water, waste management, and then you start sort of seeing this. And again, most farmers are probably doing a lot of this anyway. It's sort of in terms of what the external key stakeholders or markets are looking for is this kind of tied up by a red ribbon and presented in a format. And that is partly what this whole push for non-financial sustainability reporting or climate risk reporting is about. It's about sort of consolidating and streamlining, ensuring that there's comparability, consistency around the information that's being produced and the information flows that are being passed through from the farmers through to Coles, through to the investors, through to the banks. Everyone needs to be talking the same language. So going back to the beginning, and that is starting the journey, starting small steps. You don't need to kind of overkill it, and then eventually our knowledge and our maturity of sustainability integration into our businesses will become business as usual, and I won't have a job, which is hopefully the case.
So that's funny. One of the questions that came through was like, where should a farmer start? Because the whole idea was quite intimidating. Is there an excellent gateway activity into this reporting process that you've identified at RSM?
Yeah, well, we think so. And we are actually holding a workshop tomorrow called ESG Essentials. If you're interested, I think we only have 2 places left. No, but yeah, it's kind of understanding that carbon is the big game in town at the moment, and it is going to be the mandatory metric under the climate risk reporting. So carbon emissions is probably the first place to start. But then you want to move on to more holistic sort of reporting around your waste, your water, biodiversity, these sorts of things to account for what, the value is in your business. So again, you just do a sort of a, back of the envelope material risk assessment on what's happening in your business, what's happening around you. And, most small farmers, etc., won't be captured by this mandatory reporting accounting, but again, you're part of someone else's emission profile. So again, the emissions is probably absolutely the first part to start with. But in terms of keeping pace with where the market is going. You know, the train has left. So being able to, again, control your own narrative around what you're doing on your property, what you're doing in your business, it's really important, so that it's the accounting term, if not, why not? So if you say nothing, someone's going to assume the worst. So you're better off saying something, being honest around what you're doing, and that's where we are across all sectors, all business sizes, is that we just need to start now, and we need to start reporting and disclosing this information across our sectors, because this information is going to inform investment decisions, and this is the risk that investors are looking to assess those investments by.
Yep, great. Question for you, Bob. It's an interesting one, and I think maybe, I don't recall you saying you were getting a margin for any of your environmental work, but Bill asked, if you're going to save your carbon credits for product insetting, has your market indicated it's prepared to pay you as big a margin as you could receive by selling ACCUs, for instance?
So that was about basically...
Like, will the market pay you more for insetting? Rather, is it worth more to you to inset and then sell at a margin, or is it actually just better for you to sell ACCUs instead?
It's a really good question, and I don't know, I have no idea. But the thing about this, talk about the risk, like we've signed ours up to 100 years because it's an area that was needed to go into trees, and there's no risk until you've sold the credit. Basically, you start the scheme, you register it, and you start accruing, and you have like an ACCU bank account. They're there like money you've got in your bank. And so for insetting opportunities I see, like there's a big lupin industry in WA. I could see something like, we don't spray paraquat when we don't crop top lupins, so they'll be chemical free. I'd like to do something like paraquat free, carbon neutral box lupins into Europe. I think potentially there'll be a time, but I'm not sure. But it's also a business, and if the price of ACCUs under the safeguard mechanism goes to $100, it's a business. It's going to be really difficult not to sell those, and then that, you know, if you got that, you're talking serious amounts of money, and then that gives you a whole ability to do a whole pile of other good stuff with that. So I think you very much keep that option open would be the answer.
Nicole and Richard Eckert on a panel that I was moderating yesterday on leaders and laggers for emissions said we should never have put a price on trees and carbon because it's distorting the market. Basically, it's like we'll just go and buy offsets rather than to make the right investments. What's your view on that?
Do you want to go start first?
I'll have a go. I've been thinking about this a lot, and we can see it play out, I think, in the state more than others. I think the idea of a price on carbon and the market operating to be efficiently kind of seeking least cost abatement is a very good economic theory, but it works when there is an actual price on carbon and where you have that equal playing field, because the idea would be that, you can plant some trees because it's cheaper to do that than to take action, but soon it gets quite expensive, and so you start taking action in your own operations. I think what we've had at the moment is a very patchwork approach, and we don't have an effective price on carbon. We have an indirect price, we have different pressures, we have mixed signals, and so you do have a situation where you have this kind of distorting effect, and it is still cheaper for many, many businesses to buy offsets, and that will probably where that price point is. And we are kind of delaying the actual transition of the economy by kind of dragging this thing out, right? And I think that if we just had an effective price on carbon back in the day and the price had gone up the way it should have, I think we would have seen real decarbonisation in the economy a lot quicker. And actually, if that had applied equally to the agricultural sector and you didn't have these weird carve-outs, Agri would need to make that decision for themselves as well. And I think insetting would have become much more of a real thing. But at the moment, it's very patchwork, and it creates all these distortions. And so in that instances, I would probably say, yeah, it's problematic, right? It's not a perfect market, not by any means.
And I'm going to touch on that for a second, Heech, as well, just for you, because one of the kind of theses around investing in natural capital is that somehow I'm going to be generating carbon credits, or I'll be generating biodiversity credits, and that is a distorted market. So if you're an investment fund investing on a 25-year time frame, you're trying to get a yield out of that property, and then you have this layer over the top, which theoretically is bringing you income, but can keep fluctuating depending on whether or not Woodside's desperate to buy 100 million accus, or there's a global carbon price which changes, or something like that. Does that really make it quite hard to value those extra bits on top of a land investment?
It's a very complex question in some ways, but maybe I'll just break it down from my perspective. I mean, I have high respect for Professor Eckhart and what he's doing. And I think philosophically, I don't disagree with his statement. But the reality is, the safeguard is not just about accus. The safeguard requires emitters, big facilities, to decarbonise. They need to decarbonise year on year, and the baseline's been set and they have to comply. But these sectors are hard to transition. Steel manufacturers, we need steel. We need some of these, we need resources to make batteries in the transition. We need timber. So these industries are not easy to transition, and an absolute abatement without carbon credits in the time frame we've set ourselves and the world has set ourselves is really difficult, impossible, without carbon, without a mechanism or a technology to sequester carbon. And what we mean by that is to draw down carbon from the atmosphere, which needs to happen beyond 2050. And actually the cheapest source of technology at the moment are trees. Like you can put technology in place to, direct storage, carbon capture, all of that. They're super expensive. If you look at CSIRO's cost model, trees are actually a very inexpensive way to sequester carbon and to draw down carbon into the soils. Now, there's a price to that. Someone has to pay for the collection of seeds, the propagation of seedlings. There is a cost to that. So if it means that you can subsidise that cost through a carbon credit, why not? And we're putting more trees for better soil management, to Bob's earlier example, as well as, carbon credits into the market. There are, corporates who have obviously very big ambitions and strategies around the volume of carbon they need. But I think it's important to work with your counterparties who are actually very focused on decarbonising, in their entire operations first, and then what's left. I feel like trees investing in nature is a good thing. Like if you look at the European carbon trading system, they're not producing anything extra. All they're doing is trading off the budget, their carbon credit budget. Whereas we have decided to actually, why don't we do something proactive? And our accus are based on nature methods, which no other regulatory carbon credit system in the compliance carbon system in the world has. So that to me is a really unique opportunity. And to Bob's point, weigh up how you want to manage that asset. I've seen assets in New South Wales that we have exposure to that aren't really great for cropping just because of the topography, the soil, even though it's got fantastic rainfall. So what else can we use that for? Maybe carbon. So it's not a simple linear kind of, we need more carbon, therefore we just plant more trees. You've got to manage the landscapes more holistically and think about the business model differently, is what I would say. But just
quickly on that, but if you're talking to global investors, and let's go beyond just superannuation funds who probably are being forced by their members to go down this path, the likes of a BlackRock, for instance, who has a much higher kind of threshold for what they invest in, are they looking at natural capital products and saying, I can't put a valuation on accus or carbon credits or biodiversity credits or soil sequestration or any of that stuff because that number is not a number that I can put into my model and spits out a number at the end of it that says to me, I will make 11% on my return.
Yeah, that's true. It's frontier stuff from an investment valuation perspective because there's not enough long-standing data points. The discovery on pricing is very murky. A lot of the contracts in the carbon market at the moment, whether it's voluntary, there's voluntary markets as well, or compliance is, they're sort of bilateral agreements. So price discovery is really hard to be able to then say, plug it into my financial model and I know where that price curve is going. So, you know, our philosophy and investment thesis is, can we find capital partners to come with us to sort of back that actually the carbon prices will move. They will, because we have a natural, our carbon credits are based on nature methods and they're not infinite. So you just have to apply basic 101 economics to know that the supply-demand constraints will come.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to add, I think she captured that really well at the start then. I think we've got to be really, really careful to demonise the oil and gas sector and all this. They're basically being forced to do what they're doing by regulation and policy. They don't want to be planting trees on productive agricultural land. So I think to maybe counter some of the unintended consequences of this, we've got to look at maybe some regulation around percentage of land use that can go into re-veg and all the rest. And I think there's things we can now do to make sure we to minimise any potential downside damage. Because, through a lot of if we use WA again, it's a bit of everything. It's a mosaic sort of farming pattern is actually what works really well.
I had a great chat with someone yesterday talking about the fact that it's so expensive now to buy land that the succession process is getting more and more difficult. If you hand it over, you're fine. But if you're a young farmer trying to start out, it's just way too expensive, the capital cost of getting involved in this. Is that where you can see a model where you can say to a Woodside, you buy the land and I'll lease it from you as a farmer under regenerative practices or natural capital practices, and we kind of have a collaboration there, that it might be a new funding model for farming?
Yeah, absolutely. That could be a fantastic model. I don't think they're there yet. So they bought a big wheat belt property and 50% was really good agricultural land. They would buy it and then basically do a long-term lease on the good cropping zones, and then tree out the zones that need trees could potentially be a great model. And they're already very openly will have a discussion if someone in the crowd was a farmer and there was a farm he liked, but he was concerned there was 30% in one corner that was pretty poor country for cropping or for grazing. They would absolutely collaborate and go in together and look at purchasing a property and working with you. They want to do the right thing.
I just want to say that carbon's not going to take over product like key productive areas, because we still need to feed the planet. So it's a balance, and as Bob talked about, the mosaic nature of our assets is, on one field even on one paddock you can have different microclimates that impact it. So how you think about the design of your asset, the opportunities around different revenue streams should be considered, but I don't see a world where carbon credits are going to take over productive assets at scale where we end up with a larger problem, which is food shortage and impact to our production.
I think if you look at ag as a whole, that's probably true. But if you go to a more localised level and just look at the eastern wheat belt of WA, there is definitely areas that it could be problematic. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that should be sort of, in some ways, the industries need to self-regulate on that. As soon as you put regulation on top of,
but how do you self-regulate regulation? It's not.
Yeah, I think it's about how you think about land management. I agree. If Woodside are out there buying up big tracts of land and they're happy to pay overs, that's hard to sort of regulate. Because you want to be able to manage in free markets. If you're a landowner, actually, maybe you want to retire, maybe, you might want to sell to Woodside. But I have heard in Queensland, parts of Queensland, some farmers are being very selective about who the buyer is for their asset, and they are, and that's not self-regulation, but it's participating in the broader sort of, I guess, narrative around climate versus food.
John, perhaps the new working group for AgriFutures to think about that one for a little bit. Catherine, question here. How do we make sure that farmers are the beneficiaries of their work to improve natural capital and the value doesn't just flow up the supply chain? It's an accounting question, effectively, right?
Yeah, listen, I think his name was Justin before. He really kind of spoke to that and that concept of shared value, and the fact that, the cost of compliance, etc., doesn't just fall on the end of the supply chain, and again, I think this has been problematic across a number of industries. Who's clipping the ticket along the way, and that the value is being benefited, the profit at the other end. So, listen, I think you know, I think that idea that that Justin was sort of mentioning, that, you know, the big corporates do have to play a part in, if they're asking for those Scope 3 emissions, if they're asking for that data, they need to be providing some help and support. If the banks are coming and asking for that data, maybe they should be sort of partially funding the efforts that go along with it. So yeah, I definitely believe there should be some sharing of that effort and the cost as well. You know, essentially they're being asked to transition. We all are. That's it. Harder for agricultural, harder for some sectors to do it. So sustainability today, you know, it's got to be government, it's got to be industry, it's got to be community. And this is the challenge of today, is because we've all kind of worked in silos and we've worked in a sort of a linear way, profit-driven, and now we're actually being asked to work in this kind of multi-dimensional, you know, complex web of having to consider 1,000 things now as opposed to just a few. So really difficult, but again, you know, it's just start somewhere and start conversations. Partnerships, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more kind of unconventional partnerships in the market. So I think it's just being open to a brave new world.
Nicole, with 15 seconds left, a tough one, but how do you write that into the taxonomy, or do you write into it? Is it one of the requirements of creating this policy?
There goes the 6 seconds.
I mean, it does go to that question around do no harm, and it does that equity sharing around the data piece is a hard nut to crack, but we need to crack that nut. Like, who benefits from this information? Who pays? Probably don't have the time to say how you would integrate that into the taxonomy, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think this is something that all of us need to think about in terms of the value that information brings, the packaging and giving that information out, and how we spread that cost equally.
Just quickly, so do you get feedback? I mean, do people submit to you and they kind of write in to do no harm? So are you getting enough submissions from agriculture, whether it's farmers or lobby groups, etc.?
So we're going to be starting, hopefully, with the agri criteria at around mid-year. There will be an open expression of interest process to join our technical expert groups, and I know there are a lot of experts in the room, so thank you for the plug. Watch out for that. We'd love to hear from people.
Okay, so the lesson is be engaged or be disengaged by the system. That's it, I guess, yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, please thank our panellists. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Nicole, Heech, Bob and Catherine.